Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Fasten your seatbelts, because today we're going to explore a world that not many get to see. Emergency procedures for pilots.
Ooh, exciting.
We have some pretty fascinating excerpts here from, specifically Chapter 18 of the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook.
Yes, and I think it's worth mentioning that, this handbook, it's not meant to replace those detailed instructions that each aircraft manufacturer gives, right?
Right.
It's more like a universal guide, built on the idea that if you understand those core principles behind these emergency procedures, you'll be able to make, those split-second, those life-saving decisions up in the air.
So it's not just about, memorizing checklists.
No, no, no.
It's more about understanding the mindset of a pilot when they're in an emergency.
Exactly. And that brings us to our first key point, which is the human factor. The handbook actually, it really digs deep into the psychological challenges that pilots face during emergencies.
I can only imagine.
It's not always about knowing what to do. Sometimes it's about overcoming your own instincts.
Okay, I'm curious now. What kind of instincts are we talking about here?
Well, just picture this, right? You're thousands of feet up in the air, something goes wrong, your brain is suddenly flooded with adrenaline. Your first instinct might be, denial. The handbook actually calls it reluctance to accept the situation. Like you might tell yourself, this can't be happening, right? But that delay in accepting reality, precious time wasted.
It's kind of like how people freeze up in a car accident even when there's things that they could be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in aviation, those split seconds, huge. The handbook, it emphasizes the importance of training for this very reason. Pilots practice these emergency procedures over and over again, not just to memorize the steps, but to kind of build that muscle memory that kicks in, even when fear starts to take over.
So training basically helps them push past that initial shock.
Yeah, precisely. But there's another layer to this too. You see, fear, it can cloud judgment. It can lead to panic, poor decision making. It's that classic fight or flight response, but neither of those is particularly helpful when you're trying to land a plane safely.
That's so true. I mean, I can only imagine the kind of pressure that pilots are under in those situations. Does the handbook talk about how they, manage that pressure?
It does. It emphasizes compartmentalization. Pilots are trained to focus on the immediate task at hand, step by step, rather than getting overwhelmed by the big picture.
That makes sense, yeah. Breaking things down into those smaller, manageable steps.
Right. And then there's this fascinating concept that Handbook brings up, the desire to save the airplane. It's like a really powerful instinct. But sometimes the best way to save yourself is to sacrifice the plane.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The handbook actually draws a parallel to car crashes, saying, sometimes hitting a tree head on is safer than trying to swerve and hitting it on the driver's side. And in a plane, sometimes sacrificing what they call dispensable structure, the wings or the landing gear, can actually absorb the impact and protect the people inside that cabin.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around, letting go of something that you're trying so hard to control to make sure that you survive.
It is. But that's why understanding the physics of a crash landing is so important. The handbook goes into detail about, energy absorption, deceleration, how to slow the plane down over the longest possible distance to kind of minimize the force on the people inside.
So they're basically trying to stretch out the impact to make it less severe.
Exactly. And there's actually this statistic, it's mentioned in the handbook, and it really illustrates this point. A 9G deceleration at 50 miles per hour only needs, get this, a 9.4-foot stop distance.
Wow, that's way shorter than I would have thought. It just really goes to show you how even a small reduction in speed can have a huge impact on the force of that crash. But, you mentioned something earlier, and it's just this counterintuitive idea that sometimes they'll land gear up. It just seems so wild. But I guess it kind of makes sense when you think about, the physics of it all.
You're right. The handbook, it does mention that, but it's really important to emphasize here. Pilots should always, always, always follow those manufacturers' guidelines for their specific aircraft. There might be some unique situations where, landing gear up is safer, but it's a really, really complex decision.
So knowing the rules, but also knowing when you can, kind of bend them a little bit, always keeping in mind, what's best for survival in that particular moment.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us to another fascinating topic, which is terrain. I found this section in the handbook just so engaging because it really paints these vivid pictures of what it would be like to land a plane in all these different environments.
It really It really highlights the importance of what pilots call situational awareness, like always knowing what's around you, always kind of having a plan in case you need to make that emergency landing.
So what are some of the terrains that they, like, talk about in there?
Well, there's ditching in water, which surprisingly might be less violent than other landings. But of course, you have to worry about things like, depth perception, currents.
It's almost like landing on a huge mirror, right?
Yeah, yeah. Judging your altitude and your descent rate becomes really, really difficult without those familiar visual cues.
Okay, so what about landing in a forest? That sounds terrifying.
It can be, but the handbook actually refers to it as like the Goldilocks scenario. Not too tall, dense crowns are the best. They actually use the analogy of hanging the plane in the branches, using the trees to kind of gradually slow the plane down.
So finding that sweet spot where the trees absorb the impact, but they don't completely, destroy the plane. What about like a confined area, something like a river that seems like it would be a good option?
It might seem that way, but you have to make sure that you can clear those wingtips. Even a seemingly open space can quickly become like an obstacle course when you're trying to land a plane. It's all about carefully evaluating your options and choosing the best one, based on the specific circumstances.
That's a great point. Every situation's so unique, right? There's no one-size-fits-all kind of solution. But there's one more scenario I really want to discuss before we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, and that's the impossible turn. This is like the stuff of legends. It's the maneuver they tell all the student pilots, never attempt this. But is it truly impossible?
That is a fantastic question, and it's one that the handbook tackles head on. Let's break it down in the next part of our dive.
Okay, so we left off talking about the impossible turn. Like, it almost sounds like something out of a movie, right?
Right.
But the handbook actually talks about it.
It does. It does. The impossible turn, it's this idea of like turning back to the runway if your engine fails during takeoff. So imagine, right, you've just lifted off, you're not very high, and
Right.
boom, you lose power.
Oh, scary.
Right. So your instinct might be to turn back, right, back to the safety of that runway.
Right.
But the handbook really lays out like the dangers of that, using some like pretty stark numbers to kind of illustrate the point.
Yeah, I remember reading about a specific example. It really stuck with me.
Yeah, they use this scenario of an aircraft at 300 feet experiencing a 4-second delay before they initiate a standard rate turn. And get this, with those parameters, the plane would end up over 1,000 feet, like it's on the 16 feet below the runway.
Wow.
Below the runway.
So it's not just about like turning the plane, it's about having enough altitude and airspeed to actually make that turn safely. Exactly. And there are so many factors at play here.
Mm-hmm.
The aircraft's climb performance, wind conditions, even just the pilot's reaction time. It's a maneuver with like really high stakes. It illustrates the importance of, training and judgment.
For sure. It makes you wonder, like, what's going through a pilot's mind when they're faced with a decision like that? Do they rely on instinct? Is it more about, like, a calculated risk?
Honestly, I think it's a little bit of both. Their training prepares them for these scenarios, but ultimately it comes down to like assessing that situation in real time and just making the best decision possible.
Are there, like, any famous examples of pilots who have successfully pulled off this impossible turn?
I mean, there are a few documented cases, but they're incredibly rare. And it's important to remember that success often depends on factors that are beyond the pilot's control. But these stories do highlight like just the incredible skill and courage it takes to execute something like that.
Yeah. It's just a good reminder that aviation, it's as much about human skill as it is about the technology,
Absolutely.
And speaking of skill, let's kind of move on to some of the other emergencies that the handbook covers. I really like how this handbook goes beyond just like listing procedures, It really dives into like the why behind everything.
Yeah, I agree. It's about empowering those pilots with the knowledge, not just those rote instructions.
Exactly. So let's dive into a few more emergencies and see what we can learn. How about electrical fires? They seem like a total nightmare scenario up in the air.
They are, but the handbook does provide some helpful guidance. One of the first things to look out for is actually the smell of burning insulation. It's like that early warning sign.
That makes sense. What's the best thing to do if you, detect an electrical fire? Like, what should you do?
Well, your instinct might be to just like shut off all the power immediately, right?
Yeah.
But that's actually not always the best approach.
Really? Why not? Wouldn't cutting the power stop the fire from spreading?
I mean, it might, but you also have to think about what systems you might need in order to land that plane safely. It's almost like a high-stakes game of chess, right? You have to think strategically about which systems are like essential and which ones you can kind of sacrifice.
So it's about staying calm, assessing the situation, before you take any drastic actions.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about another tricky situation. Let's talk about a blocked pitot-static system. This one is a real challenge because it affects so many crucial instruments.
Yeah, I remember reading about this one in the handbook. Isn't the pitot-static system like what provides airspeed and altitude readings?
That's it. And if it gets blocked, all your instruments start giving you like false information. You might think you're higher than you actually are. You might think you're going faster than you actually are. And that can lead to spatial disorientation and, some pretty dangerous consequences.
That sounds terrifying. It's like your senses are betraying you. What can a pilot do in that situation?
It all comes down to recognizing the problem and then knowing how to work around it. The handbook, it stresses the importance of understanding your aircraft's systems, like inside and out. You might need to switch to alternate static sources or, maybe rely on some other cues to maintain control of the aircraft.
So it's a real test of the pilot's, knowledge and resourcefulness.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
just goes to show that, even in this age of advanced technology, the pilot's expertise and judgment still paramount.
So true. Speaking of testing your limits, let's talk about something straight out of an action movie. What happens if a door opens mid-flight?
Well, it's actually more common than you might think. And you're right, it does sound, dramatic, but the real danger isn't actually the open door itself. It's the pilot's reaction.
Okay, so stay calm, fly the plane.
Yeah.
Anything else? What else should I know?
Well, the handbook specifically cautions against trying to grab the door. It's a natural instinct, right?
Right.
But it can actually make the situation worse. The best thing to do is just maintain control of the aircraft and then land as quickly and safely as possible.
So just a reminder that sometimes the simplest action is the best action, especially when you're dealing with something, so unexpected. But what about when, technology steps in to help?
Yeah.
The handbook also mentions some, pretty amazing advancements that are changing the way we handle emergencies.
You're talking about things like, those ballistic parachutes for, the whole aircraft in those emergency Autoland systems, right?
Yes. Imagine pulling a ripcord and your whole plane just gently floats down to the ground under this, giant parachute. It seems like science fiction, but it's becoming a reality.
It is. These systems are becoming more and more common, especially in, those light aircraft. And then, you've got emergency Autoland, or ELR as they call it, which is truly remarkable.
It's like having a virtual co-pilot that can land the plane for you. I was reading about it in the handbook. It blew my mind.
Yeah. The handbook goes on to explain how EL can, it chooses a suitable landing spot. It transmits those messages to air traffic control. It can even, compensate if it loses GPS signal.
Wow. It sounds so complex.
It is, but it's also a testament to how far, aviation technology has come.
Yeah.
These systems are designed to really increase safety
and
just give those pilots more options in those critical situations.
But there's got to be a but.
There is. As impressive as all these systems are, they also raise some questions about, pilot reliance on automation. The handbook does touch on this as well. The human element, the pilot's expertise and judgment, it's always going to be crucial in aviation, especially when it comes to dealing with those unexpected situations.
It's finding that balance, between embracing the new technology and maintaining those core piloting skills. It's a theme that we see everywhere.
Yeah.
But that's, a conversation for another day. For now, let's kind of shift gears and wrap up our deep dive today by looking at the big picture of what we've learned. Welcome back, everyone. We've covered a lot of ground in our exploration of emergency procedures for pilots, from those split-second decisions to, the cutting-edge technology, all shaping how we think about aviation safety.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. We've really peeked behind the curtain and gotten to see how complex and nuanced it is to handle an emergency up in the air.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me has been that emphasis on the human element. We talked a lot about the psychological stuff that pilots face. Things like, that reluctance to accept that something bad is happening, or the fear that can just cloud your judgment, and even that instinct to try to save the plane, even when it means, putting their own safety on the line.
Yeah, that's a good point. Understanding those mental hurdles, it's just as important as knowing the technical procedures, right?
Yeah.
The handbook, it really drives home that point that, the pilot's mindset, it can be their greatest asset or their biggest liability when there's an emergency.
And it's so fascinating how the training that pilots go through is designed to address those mental challenges, right?
Yeah.
To kind of like help them build that resilience and those decision-making skills that they need to stay, calm and focused when things get really hairy.
Exactly. Think about the impossible turn we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
right? It's not just about knowing, like, physically how to maneuver the plane. It's also about having the mental strength and fortitude to assess the situation and weigh those risks and make that split-second decision right, the one that could, mean life or death.
It's just wild to think about the responsibility that these pilots have and the skills that they need to navigate those high stakes situations.
It is. It is. And, we also discussed, like, how crucial it is for those pilots to really be aware of their surroundings.
Yeah.
That situational awareness, right?
Yeah.
Knowing the terrain, the weather, potential landing spots. It's key to making, like, informed decisions when something goes wrong.
It really is, whether it's a forced landing in a forest or, ditching in the water or even just trying to find a safe spot in like a confined area, that awareness can really be the difference between, a good outcome and a tragic one. And it ties back into what we were saying earlier about like how the handbook goes beyond just procedures. It's about giving those pilots the knowledge, the understanding they need to make good choices, even when the unexpected happens, right?
It really is. It's about, giving them the tools to be problem solvers, not just, rule followers. And that's where things like understanding the physics of a crash landing come in.
Exactly. We talked about how like energy absorption and deceleration are so important in those situations, right? How
Mhm.
even minimizing your speed just a little bit can really reduce like the force of that impact.
It is. It's a great reminder that even when things are really, really bad, there are still things that pilots can do to give themselves a better chance of making it out okay.
Absolutely. And then, there's that whole other world, that whole fascinating world of those new technologies that are emerging, like those ballistic parachutes that can bring down a whole aircraft or those emergency Autoland systems.
Yeah, it's really something else, right? I mean, to think that we're at a point now where technology can step in and help pilots in ways that, maybe we never even imagined. These advancements are really changing how we think about safety and aviation.
Yeah, but like we discussed, there's always that balance, right? We have to balance our reliance on technology with, maintaining those core piloting skills.
Exactly. That human element. It's always going to be crucial. Pilots still need to be able to think for themselves, to adapt, to make decisions when, technology fails or the situation changes.
So it's not about replacing pilots altogether. It's about figuring out, how technology and human expertise can work together to make things even safer.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And honestly, I think that's a great point for us to wrap up this deep dive. Knowledge is power. And even for those of us who aren't pilots, just understand these principles we talked about today, I think it gives us a better appreciation for how complex aviation safety really is.
I agree completely. It's been a fascinating look into a world that, most of us never get to see. We've explored the challenges, the skills, the incredible ingenuity that goes into keeping us all safe when we fly.
And hey, maybe this deep dive has even, inspired a few of our listeners to learn more about aviation, to, maybe even think about becoming pilots themselves.
Maybe. We've certainly learned a lot today, and we hope you have too. So what stuck with you? What surprised you? What are you going to be thinking about tomorrow? Let us know. We're always up for another deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep looking up.